Hi, everyone. I'm here to talk to you about the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. The first thing we need to understand is why it happened in the 1950s and 60s, the context for it. Remember, after the Civil War that ended in 1865, at least on paper, blacks were supposed to be treated equally. Slavery had finally ended. Blacks were granted citizenship and they were given the right to vote. But as we know from our studies, that did not happen. Things like Jim Crow laws emerged that segregated blacks. Poll taxes, literacy tests were used to keep them from voting. And so they still had not been granted equality. And so in the 1950s and 60s, that is going to be challenged. There were some things to try to, some milestones that had happened prior to the 1950s and 60s civil rights movement, including Jackie Robinson integrating baseball. If you've seen the movie 42, that's the story of that. And then also Truman desegregated the military. And so in 1950, during the Korean War, that'll be the first time that U.S. troops will be integrated. But otherwise, prior to 1954, racial segregation was the norm in the United States. And you saw signs like this with separate waiting rooms, separate movie theaters, and of course, separate schools. And that's what this map shows you. Everything in red were states that required separate schools. And remember from the famous Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896, these segregated facilities were legalized, but under the premise of separate but equal. But as we can see, things were far from equal. Here you can see the Black kids' school in one particular town in South Carolina and the corresponding white kids' school. They were far from equal. Remember, white kids' schools got 10 times more funding than Black kids' schools. And so the Brown family, here you can see Linda Brown here, is going to challenge that, the fact that her daughter was not being given an equal education. And ultimately, it's going to make its way all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1954, there will be a historic ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, in which the Supreme Court says that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal, meaning that idea from Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. So this is going to be huge. People start to wonder if the tide of the country is finally starting to turn. This is going to desegregate schools, but it does not desegregate all of the other public facilities. But at least this was a big change, and that's going to help prompt the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s and push activists to now demand integration in all facilities. Some people are going to resist this ruling, and there will be it'll still be a battle to integrate schools, as you can see by some of these signs. The next big event in the civil rights movement, since the Brown versus Board of Education will help kind of spawn all of these activists to now hope that the tide had turned, will be Rosa Parks, pictured here seated on a bus. Remember, buses in the South were segregated. There was a black section and a white section, and Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white person, as she was mandated to do, and got arrested, as you can see pictured on the top right. This is going to spawn a boycott, actually led by the very young Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He is going to be a big fan of a boycott, because a boycott is a nonviolent form of protest. A boycott is when you refuse to buy something. So in this case, the black passengers refuse to ride the bus. And you can see that in the lower picture there, that they are going to now just walk. Every time they needed to go to work, they're going to walk or get carpools. Every time they need to go to the store. This lasted for about 11 months, but ultimately the buses in Alabama do finally get desegregated. Next big event I want you to know about, and again, everything in red, like the Montgomery bus boycott and Brown versus Board. Little Rock 9 is also a Quizlet term, so definitely make sure we know it. We go to Little Rock, Arkansas. Remember, this is after the Brown decision that's supposed to integrate public schools. There are going to be 9 black students that are going to be try to desegregate Central High School, which is a historic all-white school in the capital, Little Rock, Arkansas. The governor of Arkansas, first brings out the National Guard to stop those 9 black students from integrating the high school. So if you look in the top right, that's one of the famous pictures of one of the Little Rock 9 students being taunted was like a mob scene that erupted outside Central High School. Ultimately, then it brings us to the bottom picture. The President of the United States, President Eisenhower, got involved and actually sent in federal troops to make sure that those 9 Black students could thereafter be able to go to school. And they stayed with those Black students and escorted them to school because it was still such a tenuous time period. Imagine the President of the United States getting involved in the affairs of Carl Sandburg High School. It was a big deal. That brings us to SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that's organized at this time, and they're going to help organize protests such as the sit-ins. The businesses in the South relied on Blacks for shopping at them, but they refused to allow them to sit at their lunch counters. And so SNCC would organize these sit-ins in which they were nonviolent again, and they would the activists would just sit in at these lunch counters, refusing to leave until they'd be served. And sometimes they did lead to violence and oftentimes to arrests. Which brings us to the March on Washington in 1963. Birmingham, Alabama, which right before this was a heated summer of violence. Dr. King even gets arrested there and writes his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. But the civil rights movement kind of culminates now in this march. Again, a nonviolent form of protest, which Martin Luther King was a huge fan of. About 250,000 people emerge on the nation's capital to try to send a message to Congress that, hey, we need a civil rights bill to desegregate all facilities. The culminating, the keynote speaker, of course, was Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. And hopefully you'll get a chance to listen to it in class, or you should, YouTube it. There's a reason why many consider it to be the greatest speech in American history. But Martin Luther King, in his speech and in his other speeches, is going to continue to advocate for nonviolence, despite the abuse and the physical violence that oftentimes his nonviolent protests triggered. He still pushed for nonviolence. He is also all about integration. He believes that there is a time when Blacks and whites can live together, hand in hand, and that is what he is pushing for. Ultimately, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed in large part due to all of these protests. Lyndon Johnson signs this historic piece of legislation that is going to ban segregation in public facilities. So remember, Brown is going to desegregate schools. This act, Civil Rights Act of 64, now desegregates all other public facilities. It also is going to not allow discrimination in hiring based on your gender or race, which will be huge. Another leader that is going to emerge at this time is a guy named Malcolm X, who's going to take a very different approach from Dr. King. As you can see from his quote, we are nonviolent only with nonviolent people. He believed that these nonviolent measures, were not working, and he gained a following. And so he is going to push for armed self-defense. Again, he's not pushing for violence, but just if you were to get attacked, as many of these civil rights activists did at the time, he says you have every right to fight back. And so this was a contrasting ideology compared to Dr. King saying, no, we must be nonviolent. So there's armed self-defense, which was a key cornerstone of Malcolm X's teachings, as well as he believed that Blacks and whites could never be integrated, that the best way for Blacks to be treated equally was actually for them to separate. Now, he didn't want them to separate and actually be treated unequally, but he wanted Blacks to shop at Black-owned businesses and be separated from whites, and because he thought that they could never be truly equal in an integrated society. So that was another big difference that you should note between these two leaders. So both gain a following at this time. But unfortunately, Malcolm X is going to be assassinated in 1965. He's just 39 years old as he starts to kind of retreat, actually, in some of his messages. And so he will get assassinated, but he will also help to inspire another group that I'll talk about in a second. At this time, there is also the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan. Remember, that started after the Civil War. They're very influential in the 1950s and 60s. They were not just relegated to the South, but also even came up to places like Chicago to try to intimidate Blacks. And remember, one of their big things was always trying to stop Blacks from getting the right to vote. And remember, the Civil Rights Act did not address the fact that Blacks were not able to vote. So that is what's going to spawn this Selma March to try to push for the right to vote. So a group of civil rights activists organized a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, the capital of the state. Again, it's a nonviolent march, as they're just trying to raise awareness of the fact that Blacks are not able to fully vote because of the literacy test and poll tax. As you can see by the top left picture, it is met by, again, more violence. This is all captured on television. Ultimately, the President of the United States gets involved. At this point, it's Lyndon B. Johnson saying that this march needs to take place. And the lower right is the march taking place weeks later, as the federal government got involved to make sure that the march could peacefully go. It was a 54-mile march, so imagine walking from like here to Chicago and back just to raise awareness. Ultimately, it did lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which again was historic because it eliminated literacy tests. Eventually will lead to the 24th Amendment passage, which will get rid of the poll taxes. And as you can see from the chart, this is huge for actually finally giving Blacks the right to vote. You can see the low percentage of Blacks being registered prior to it and the huge increase thereafter. So finally, by 1965, Blacks are now allowed to vote. There's still tension and inequities that kind of manifest themselves in these race riots that started in a neighborhood in LA called Watts after a young Black motorist was pulled over. It led to days of rioting and dozens of people being killed and property being destroyed. And ultimately, then the government did an investigation to figure out what was the root cause of it, and they determined that it was not this sort of Black militantism that had started to emerge at this time, or Black power movement that I'll talk about in a second, but it was really more about just the systemic racism, the segregation at the time that was making people so angry. The Black Panthers Party is going to be inspired by Malcolm X. So please don't get confused. Malcolm X is not a part of this group, the Black Panthers, because he had already been assassinated. It's going to be started by Huey Newton. Bobby Seale are going to be big activists. It's founded after, like I said, Malcolm X was assassinated, and they're going to push for, as you can see, not violence just by holding those guns, but again, a more militant, a more aggressive stance that, hey, you deserve to fight back if you are, your rights are violated, if you're attacked. And so that they're also going to push for, again, inspired by the teachings of Malcolm X, Black shopping at Black-owned businesses. Which brings us to the Black Power movement, which was, again, kind of a more militant, aggressive civil rights branch. Here you can see the symbol of the Black Power movement, raising your fist. And actually, this was so controversial at the Olympics that this U.S. Olympian actually was stripped of his medals for even just doing the Black Power symbol. Then the next major event was, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. being assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, at his hotel, the Lorraine Motel. As you can see, thousands of people marched for his funeral, incredibly influential civil rights leader. And that kind of brings us to the end of the 1950s and 60s civil rights movement. Clearly, it's not the end of the civil rights struggle. You could argue it's still going on to this day, but that's just the end of this time period of civil rights movement. All right. Hope that helped, guys.